last panel members, and this is going to be led by Silvia Contino from BS, from UBS, and she will be accompanied by Marcela Paranhos from TNC, Frederic Demaris, PhD and head of Hedge Duo BSBB, and Matias Teixeira, Director of Origination at EcoAgro. Hi, if you like, since it's just three of us, if you want to come to the center. And we're talking about biodiversity. And this is fake. This is synthetic, okay? I'm just cold. We're going to talk about capital mobilization for transition and resilience of the agro food systems. And I would say that Brazil has showed that regardless the difficulties of doing business in Brazil, the agribusiness sector has invented and reinvented itself with a lot of resilience, research, technology, and has become a global powerhouse in agro. And no doubt one of the main exporters of the main agricultural commodities, feeding more than 1 billion people around the world, and one of the few countries that actually can double its agricultural production without knocking down a single tree, just by leveraging areas that are already open, intensifying production in livestock activities and agricultural activities. And today we have a government program to transform 1 million hectares into pastures that have been identified as prone, agricultural prone. So we have several wins. Brazil today actually has become very prominent for the world in terms of food safety. We would look at it as emerging market. When we saw investors coming to Brazil, Brazil was seen as an emerging market, of course, an important, large market, the B from BRICS, but it was just another market compared to the others. Our cost of doing business was actually very high, and we would not always be favorably compared. But now, within this new global geopolitical situation due to the climate change and everything that's going on around the world, of course, starting with the pandemic, geopolitical issues, Brazil has really become a strategic and fundamental player for the world, and it was not before. So, especially in terms of food safety and energy safety and green energy safety, Brazil, as we know, can become a major provider due to the agriculture. I am an agronomist, actually, and I wanted to work with one kind of green, and now I'm working with a different kind of green at the bank. I'm trying to redeem myself. I'm planting trees. I am part of the coalition, and I'm here trying to go back to my roots. But Brazil, of course, does have this fundamental role, and thanks to agriculture and biomass production, Brazil can really be the major player for biofuels as well, and the whole biofuel, biomethane chain. Brazil can really become one of the major suppliers of biofuels. And now, for second generation, I had the pleasure to go to the inauguration of the second ethanol second generation plant of the E2G of Raiz in Araraquara. President Lula was there. I was there 2 weeks ago. Everybody was there. And it's amazing. And now they're extracting ethanol from sugarcane and zero competition with food, and being exported to the first SAF plant from ethanol to the U.S. in Georgia with a huge potential. So in this balance between risk and opportunity, thanks to our thriving agribusiness and all our characteristics, we have more opportunities and benefits. And I think this is a segment due to that the segment that can lose a lot due to these climate issues is it's the agribusiness, because 90% of our agriculture still depends on St. Peter sending down rain, and he has been quite a bit unusual lately. So what I see in the agribusiness today is really a major concern. I'm also part of COSAC, and of course, we'll always see agro that is more or less clear, but in general, because this is a strong sector, an exporting sector, and very much professionalized, there's a huge concern with climate issues. We understand the environment. The agro is highly dependent on the environmental issues, so there's a great engagement for all of these elements in the ecosystem. And if we don't look at this as a whole, we'll pay a very high ticket. And on that note, I want to ask you all a question. How does your company, or each representing different companies and different projects, how do you see, what are your solutions for capital mobilization for transition and resilience of food systems? And if you want to provide a brief history of how you actually got involved with these solutions, what was your trajectory? Thank you, Sylvia. Well, I'm Marcela Paranhos. I am here representing TNC, which is a conservation NGO working on the agenda of capital mobilization, be it concessional or philanthropic capital, which is our major track record, when we also have a TNC investment arm. And within several initiatives, always focusing on creating generation and sustainable production of food, energy, sustainable development in the regions where we are present. And I think we have two agendas that are more relevant here for me. The first, working with major corporations to better understand their value chains or their supply chains, and how these chains can be transformed through financial incentives. So all of the commercial flow and financial flow that goes through all of these major corporations can be used in a positive way to influence the transformation and the transition to more efficient systems. And on the other side, another agenda that TNC co-leads together with the Tropical Forest Alliance is the FAC, which is the where we have several partners here in the audience. And through EFAC, this was an initiative that was created to improve the capacity of the financial market to really internalize the track record that is being generated by some front runners, changing a little bit of the profile of these operations in terms of risk and return. So how can we help these actors and become more harmonized to actually take this or attract institutional investors? Sometimes I talk to some friends that are closer to these institutional investors, and right now they probably can't even see these products within broader strategies. But the work we need to do now is for these investments to really come in 5 or 10 years. How can we shape everything that is being done today in terms of development, the track records, the design of these financial products, so that they can actually reach a level of investment within a decade, so that we can truly change and shift the financial flows to transition food systems. So the rationale where within A fact is that we work with our partners to create this flow, this constant capital flow. It's just not a one-off project here or there. It's a project that can actually promote structural change. And have you seen some traction? How do you see traction for this? I think we still have a certain level of maturity. And I started my career in the industry and then went to the energy sector. And I see three structural differences that are very important in food systems and the industry and energy. The first one, taking Brazil's example, according to the Brazilian census, we have 5 million rural farmers that can be seen of 5 million points of risk, or on the transition perspective, 5 million opportunities. But this is also translated into 5 million or more than 5 million of individual decision-making processes. And to create any type of influence in these decision-making processes, we also need to consider that 70% of all that is familiar agriculture. It's a public that has limited or inexistent technical assistance for this transition. So when we bring this to the universe of financial mechanisms, there's still a very large challenge to translate this into elements that can actually mitigate this visualization or how the market looks at risk and truly influence the impact generation. Another important point is the impact on food system, because when we look at the reality of these rural farmers, that is part of familiar agriculture, we're talking about a spot operation without a very long-term view. It's a very short horizon, and this really challenges the structure of investing models in the long term for this transition. And a last factor that is also important for me to address is the allocation of the transition costs. If we only look at the market forces saying, okay, all production needs to be regenerative and sustainable, the market pushes this to farmers, and this transition cost will be on the farmer, which is the weakest link of the chain. So how can we use the blended finance? This is the beauty of the blended finance. How can we use these mechanisms to bring in all of these actors and all the links in the chain to share risks and costs of the transition? Because the farmers are the ones that are actually going to implement the actions at the end of the day. So reaching that end is one of the things that Banco do Brasil does very well. This is the bank, and the insurers also have the same issue, right? The insurance coverage is very low in Brazil, under 20%, and to analyze each risk individually is very difficult. So how can you really scale this analysis with technology? Fred. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Congratulations, CBI, for this event. It's great to have representatives from the private and public sector and multilateral sector. So congratulations, CBI, for all the work. And it's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panel members. Just a little bit of history. I'm representing UBS and BSBB, but I want to tell you a little bit about what our bank does. We have created this ESG advisory role in 2020. UBS BB, maybe you might not know the brand, but this is a partnership between UBS, the Swiss bank with a global presence, and Banco do Brasil for investment banks and brokers for South America, and Brazil is our focus. And having these two peers, it would be expected that ESG and sustainability has always been a very relevant focus. So we look at risk and opportunity and ESG analysis for all of our transactions, applying internal policies, which means that sometimes we cannot work with certain clients for several regions. It's important to mention that we have a very high threshold for risk, and we also have a market share of the labeled debt in Brazil. So everything that has been labeled as green, sustainable, UBSBB, was able to lead many of them. So we are very happy with our trajectory, and we are also saying that we've done a lot, but we still have great challenges ahead. Sean mentioned that we had about 20% of the way already paved. And when we look at Brazil from a global perspective, Brazil is still relatively small in terms of labeled issuance. We're talking about 13 billion BRLs issued with labels, and in the world, give or take, issues 3 times $3 trillion per year. So Brazil still has a huge potential to grow. And just to close my introduction, a very important role from the banks, and Denizio from BBS, it also mentioned in the previous panel, is the idea to engage companies, because we are the intermediaries. We are between the asset owner and the companies, and we feel all the challenges, and we know how difficult it is to bring everybody to the table. So we have several examples when we talk about engaging, talking to clients during a year and a half, 2 years, to be able to find a structure that will actually fit into the investor's portfolio. That is our work of translating. And we talk a lot about bonds, but we're also looking at any other products. It can be M&A, it could be carbon, which is a product we want to develop. So this is the role of the bank. I heard colleagues from other banks saying this, and it's not different for us. It's the role of the role of educating, right? Because we've been working with CBI since the beginning, and CBI was a great driver for green and sustainable bonds in Brazil. So how do you educate your teams? We have always mentioned that we had the mission of being the market leader and educating the client, working together, because it wasn't always obvious the advantages. It was seen as just more cost without clear advantages. I think we've turned that page.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Once again, thanks Sylvia and Marcelo for sharing the panel, and thanks to the CBI, not only this panel, but for what they have been doing the past years. It has been very important. And gathering everyone here is very relevant and necessary to where we're going. I'm going to bring, for example, Ecoagro. We, from the beginning, from its inception, wanted to link agri and the capital market. And in the beginning, in 2007, we had a great work with regulators, legal actions in the financial market to be able to create this world. And then in 2009, 2 years later, we have the first CRA in the Brazilian market, which was great. And we see how this market has developed in the past years. And what we try to bring and do together with the sustainability market is the same. So we managed to issue back in 2016 the first green CRA in the country that has been around for 8 years. Of course, this market was a bit turbulent in the past 8 years, so it was not easy for the market to develop and gain more traction, but it did. And what we've been doing a lot is, again, work with everybody here to create this market and create facility so that everyone can get there more easily. So we talked about frameworks and if there is a rule, how things work. So as we're just in the middle of the sandwich between the companies that want to issue debt and whoever is going to buy that debt on the other side, we bring our experience to bring information and do something that is credible and that makes sense for everybody. And of course, with the regulator at the end of the day, creating tools and mechanisms. We've seen, I'm not going into the type of government, but in the past years, all past years, we evolved as a type of bonds that can be issued, CPR, green CPR, CRA in dollars, CRA that you can issue abroad. I think that for our theme, it's going to be important and relevant because we know that the external market is more developed than the local market. So this might bring money from abroad more easily. So there are several things that are enabling all this environment for us to do this and bringing to agri. We talk about what will come first, the egg or the chicken. So many investors say, so there are no companies with nice projects. And we go to the companies and say there are not investments with benefits. So say, guys, let's go slow and build this market. And this is what we've been trying to do, especially because we see great stories from companies. It is interesting how companies do lots of nice things. And did you think that you can disclose this, show what you're doing to the rest of the planet? Why? Because you're keeping this to yourself. So when we issue those things, it's nice what we receive because the company and that takes the sustainability path from pressure from the stakeholders or the funders driving this. When you give them disclosure, you get everyone at the same time. So you see, you're doing this nice thing. So we've been trying to bring and show companies that we're going to give that publicity. We're going to create this market because there is work to be done at the end of the day. And Cristóvão was bringing this, that we have to then maintain that later on, which is important. But let's bring that because in the medium and long term, this market, well, making a parallel with CRAs, the number of CRAs issued in 2008 it was 0, and now we have 40, 50, 60 millions in CRAs per year. So the publicity of things that are working well. I like to joke that in agri, as we're a sector that you leave the producer, but as a rule you go to the public, you get to the individuals that are going to consume something. It is a sector that does lots of great things because it's B2B. There are so many Bs, but there is a C, B2C at the end. So we know that the world is aligned and concerned about that. So this we want to show this, that this exists, that this is happening. This is something that we will be able to do this quickly, and we're going to evolve. Great, Matthias. I think Anbima always mentions when we talk about the instruments that came to agri that were developed. And that was like a mea culpa because in the real estate sector, we developed a series of instruments in the past, and agri didn't ride that wave. Agri actually, this development is recent, and it came in already green. And as it happened with infrastructure as well. So I think today we see from clients today that they go straight into the green wave instead of traditional. Marcelo, you mentioned IFAC was launched in November 21 by TNC at COP26. And how has this multi-sectorial initiative as a multi-sectoral activity, how do you see TNC working specifically with financial institutions to ensure that transition for sustainable production is, as you mentioned, be inclusive and equitative? You started talking a bit about this. How do we get to that end? But how within the program, the IFACC, if you have some concrete examples? Thanks, Sylvia. I failed to thank CBI for this event. No, we'll thank in the end. I didn't do it either. We'll thank everyone at the end. I think that in terms of IFACC, how have we been working with the signatories in this product to generate this track record? I like to say that the word innovation in the IFAC acronym has three different meanings. The first one of meaning of innovation is to really understand what the market gaps are, what are the unmet needs, and that in fact need new development, which is innovation. It is new ways to make this resource flow to these needs. The second is replicability. It is a mechanism. Any one of these mechanisms, if it's too specific for that reality, it ends up being something isolated. So how can we learn from these good experiences to bring to other regions, such as Arapio has worked on, JGP and others, and actually generate that knowledge transfer and a track record to generate new products and new forms of financing. And third, which is most important of all for me, which is scale. I think we have good examples and good products, good companies today in different areas in food systems in terms of innovation and financing, but all of them are looking for scale. I think some rare mechanisms reach this pathway of scale. Some are more advanced. And the aspect of scale is related to the presence and the working the what we call catalytic capital, which is the capital that can internalize these bigger risks, give more suitable deadlines, and recognize the characteristics of this investment, and internalize impact as part of the return. This capital has very low availability in the Brazilian market, and we had in the previous panel great examples of how this has been well addressed for the Amazon, but we still need a big reinforcement for other regions of the company, especially in the Cerrado, the Atlantic Forest, and the Caatinga, where we have a production of food that is very high, and these catalytic resources and concession resources do not have the appeal of saving the Amazon. So how can we attract, in fact, for the transaction of agriculture, the catalytic resource that is necessary to unlock and attract commercial capital? So this is the work of IFACC with its signatories, with multilateral institutions, government, creating an environment for attracting good capital that is going to help to unlock a great part of these structures. Something I would add, we know that tropical agriculture fixes more carbon than temperate agriculture. We have 3 crops, we do direct till, so no till. So we have the parameters that we use today to quantify that. This is part of this attractiveness for external resources to compare where I create more impact. I know that Sylvia from Embrapa and the team are working to define parameters that are, of course, our parameters have to talk to those abroad. We talked about this in the first panels. We need to have a dialogue. It has to be credible. We need acceptable parameters, but I think part of that to increase the attractiveness of investments in Brazil, because we need external capital. That's the truth. We need capital from the private sector. We need 4 trillion or more to fund transition year after year. Today we invest 1 trillion. Governments do not have money. You need money from the private sector. And we, in our case, we need to attract resources from abroad. So part of understanding our agriculture first to destroy some negative myths about our agriculture and add the positive ones, that we have ability to have second generation fuel, can store more carbon. This is good to increase attractiveness of these and hopefully scale. Fred, a question to you. A report from Climate Policy Initiative pointed out that 30 billion in climate finance would be needed for agro-food systems. And there is an estimated deficit that is 7 times bigger than that. So considering the position, so we talked about how we are helping to bring resources, the position from UBS as a ESG leader, investor, how can the bank and banks in general being able to close this gap? Great. I'm going to get to the point of that you just mentioned, that you talked about. I don't know if education is the right word, but knowing what we're talking about. If the company is doing no-till, we need to know what is the carbon capture we're talking about here. So you need methodologies. You need knowledge from the boards as well. So we do a lot of issuances. We're talking about tens and hundreds of billions of labeled issuances. And you know that the board members do not necessarily have the tools to be able to understand what this is about, because we're talking about technical things. So it's things with indigenous peoples, it might be carbon, it might be governance. So it is very complex. You cannot imagine a regular board member to be able to know all of that. So that's the role of CBI and third parties that are specialized is very important. So this theme around awareness raising that you mentioned is crucial. When we talk about labeled, again, the role of CBI and BIMA that organize the market stakeholders, the role of the government that was working the taxonomy should have the first draft by October and final version next year. It's very important because the market can only work and direct money if we have the rules of the game and if we have the definition of what we should see or not. Otherwise, it's impossible. Sometimes we hear that the market is looking at transition, is not interested. That's not it. The market is very agile. And if you have clear rules of the game, financial incentives that sometimes we lack, the market can be very quick to escalate with impact. Our greatest goal here at UBS is scale with impact. So we are very happy with the 100 millions that we financed in the past 3 years, but we want to do much more, and Brazil has everything to do this. So the idea of the labels is essential. It is a crucial condition for us to advance. We've talked about this in other panels. We need policies, we need public policies, we need diplomacy, we need innovation. But one thing that to answer your question, Sylvia, is that it's very interesting when you compare Brazil and other countries in the region or globally, the private sector is very active. Just looking at the figures, you have the CBI figures. Ex-Brazil within Latin America, except for Brazil, what drives emissions issuances in Brazil are the companies. In the other countries, it's the governments. It's not that one is better than the other, but in Brazil, we feel that the owner of the companies, the majority, they want to do something right, and that is good for the business, for the employees. They talk about talent retention a lot. When you talk to companies, they say, why should I have a green issuance? And the board member and the CEO, they do not talk about greenium. Everybody's talk about what I'm greenium, what I'm going to get. This is a conversation for treasurer. But the company's owner, they think about retaining their talent, identifying business opportunities, the permanence of the company in the long term. It's a bit different view. But I'd leave this comment that in our meetings with companies, we feel that Brazilian business company owners, they want to incorporate these opportunities and these labels and this taxonomy that is coming. This is very positive, again, for the potential of Brazil. So company owners that translate into investors, we run a survey at UBS every 2 years with investors globally. We look at 35 countries roughly, and we ask what are the most important criteria for decision-making for investment. And Brazilians, year after year, the ESG criteria in general, they rank as high as the most of European countries. First time we ran this survey, it was a surprise to everyone. Said, wow, is Brazil so different? That's what we see globally. Women and millennials are extremely engaged. This is their number one cause, and half of the fortune of the world is in the hands of millennials and women, and growing as the baby boomers are passing on their fortunes. So there is a side of the investor and also the business owner. Matthias, talking about attracting private capital for agri-food systems. We know that it can be challenging because we have the aspect of how far you can go. Do you want to reach those that really actually need it most? How do you suggest that companies and investors should evaluate the risks, the opportunities in this space? Well, I think that the first point is you have to be careful. Opportunities, there are infinite opportunities for companies. And I always joke that both sides at the same time, you cannot go very fast and do everything at the same time. and to look for sustainability for the company, and to be more aligned with the environment, do the social and governance correctly, you at the end of the day, you need to be a sustainable company. It's no use doing a lot in 1, 2 years and not reach the third or fourth year. So it's something that, in my perception, both sides have to look at, is how much these projects and how much you're going to advance in the transition path to reach a really sustainable company. And it's to go dosing at the end the risk that you're taking and how sustainable you are as a company, not only for the rest of the people or the environment, but as a company to be sustainable. I generally joke to think about the tragedies that just went on. It's interesting how people, when it happens, they end up putting money, and then 2, 3 months later, people forget. And I bring this parallel. It's no use doing everything and doing a lot very quickly, because you're not going to reach the next 3, 4, or 5 years. So I think what's most important to analyze as for risk is whether it is going to be sustainable, what's going to be perennial. And was for both sides, both for the investor as for the company, because the investor, on the other side, they also need to think, who are the shareholders? Where is the money coming from? In order to have do business intelligently, because this is going to bring the growth of all these projects. So being very honest, that's this care and taking one step at a time, not trying to do things very fast. Perfect, Matias. Thank you. Back to Marcela. You mentioned at some point the drama around transition, because there is a cost. Transition comes at a cost. And how can you bring those that mostly need and that need capital in order to perform transition? What would be a credible transition process, thinking about the whole chain? And also within the Brazilian context. Perfect. I think for me, the main term in this transition for food systems especially is inclusion. It has to be an inclusive process because, and now using a practical example, without mentioning any names, but I had the opportunity to support a company that was receiving investment by an impact fund. And this company, in their initial stages during due diligence, they had to take up the commitment of being completely free from deforestation in the whole chain in all their operations. And that was a very point of tension during the negotiation, exactly due to the deadline that they had to attain that. And at that point, we stopped the negotiation. We came to the company to understand what is an inclusive perspective for this transition, because it's easy to think about, oh, I'm going to clean up my portfolio, be it for suppliers, investment, and so on. I'll remove everything that is of deforestation.
But who's going to be left out? They'll either no longer lead those activities or do that anymore, or they're going to be even more marginalized within the system. So how can you actually transition with new criteria, but at the same time be inclusive with the reality of these producers, of these farmers, thinking that 77% are familiar farmers? It's not the major soy producer or a livestock producer. These are small farmers who require the support. So for me, the first word is inclusion. And actually, we need a coalition of actors and solutions that will include not just the financial flow, but the recognition of these commercial strategies, the technical assistance that is paramount to prepare this transition in a regulatory environment. And we have several instruments, but we need effective implementation so that really becomes a useful instrument for the transition. So there's a combination of factors so that we can actually lead this in a more inclusive and fair manner.
Misto de
So, Fred, this is a combination of two questions, actually. And thinking about the financial system and innovative products and what you've seen, what could be offered to attract more capital? You've been engaged in several of these discussions, actually to close this funding gap, which is huge globally. So how do you see this? How do you see innovation being a part of this discussion? But before I answer your question about innovation, I just wanted to piggyback on what Marcelo was saying. Is it something that we can just remove all the difficulties, which is a huge challenge for all the banks? And of course, we're looking at that. Or do we actually want to have a bigger impact by choosing the companies and raise the bar for everybody? I'm not going to lie that everything and say that everything is peaceful within our bank, but I think there's a very strong conviction from leadership for option number two, trying to work with clients that are maybe not perfect, and many of them are not perfect, but we might have a very interesting role to improve their situation. So once again, this is a challenge, and each case is a different case and needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. But our goal as bankers, as people who want to do transactions, is trying to bring the clients in, respecting the rules of the game, and we always try to respect and request a timeline and an action plan from the clients to actually reach zero deforestation in the supplier chains. We have several clients with a chain with thousands of suppliers in Mato Grosso or in the Cerrado, and it's very complicated to do that, although we have very modern tools in Brazil, but it's very complex. So we know that this needs to be done in time. But the forestry code of the Brazilian legislation provides legal deforestation, which is not accepted abroad. So there are very relevant difficulties. I just wanted to mention that and to show you that the math is very strong within the banks. We take these topics to the committees basically weekly. But going back to innovation, I always like to say that the idea of labels is very important for the market to prevent greenwashing, and because they're buying bonds from a company, they're buying from a company that truly has positive contributions, but it's also very important within the company, and this helps the companies to classify these issues. They knew that the project with green funding, and we never questioned this. Well, so once this is classified, this is a very strong tool for C-level, saying, okay, let's put more resources here, let's spend more time on this project or this. So it's very interesting, these labels. And I'd like to mention two innovations. As you know, we were part of the launch of the blue bonds. This is a green bond that has to do with water, just to simplify. But the idea is just to highlight the ODS that get a lower volume of investment that has to do with water. And of course, in Brazil, with all of the huge sanitation needs, it would be natural that Brazil becomes a leader of blue issuances. So everything that has to do with water issuances, we were a part with Sabesp as a blue debenture with 2.9 billion, and because it was a blue bond, it attracted a lot of different contributions. And another innovation, I think I saw the Bovespa colleagues here earlier. The idea is to increase the reach beyond the bonds and look at equity and variable income represents the company as a whole, and the bond usually looks at a specific project. And B3 launched a while ago the green share. It was the first stock exchange outside of Europe to do this, so we supported them. In Europe, there are two stock exchange, London, Nasdaq, and Stockholm, with these green bonds. And now B3 is putting Brazil on the map. And I think this is really interesting for people to think that, okay, Brazil represents a relatively small volume of these labeled debt, but there's a lot of innovation, there are a lot of new things happening, and several positive things. And I think part of the COP agenda, I was talking to Isabella Teixeira yesterday, the former environment ministry for ESG, and talking about COP and how important it's going to be to show these innovations, these innovative ideas, to be more, taking a more relevant lead role, because Brazil is a global relevant player, a strategic player now in terms of green energy and sustainable energy and food security. We will certainly need to take a more protagonist role to define parameters. These are parameters that really are acceptable to be part of the international global chains. Matthias, now still on government and thinking about COP and financial entities, be them development banks, how do you see these banks working on the support for transition criterias? Thinking about Brazil, and how do you see this topic? All right. As I mentioned earlier, I think one of the things we need to really applaud, and because Brazilians like to criticize, but I really want to applaud the general evolutions with regulating governments. So I think these evolutions are taking place, and they are taking place frequently. We know that nobody plays around with agro. No government's going to play around with agro, and people pay a lot of attention to it. And we see these adjustments and get feedback. So the big point here that we still need to work on, and as we heard this whole morning, is the transparency and clarity for all of the actors to deliver good work and to make the market grow. Actually, remembering what Leonardo mentioned about the link bonds, it can't really go from 0 to 100 in a minute or a second, because we know that nobody can handle it. So this transition and looking at investors and the whole market, looking at how we are going to reach this goal, I think it's very important. So these new rules allowing achieving some milestones along the way will be really important for companies and investors to really engage, because at the end of the day, nobody starts thinking that they're going to run the whole marathon on their own. I think these milestones are going to be crucial, and regulators are very much engaged to bring instruments and subsidies so we can put everything in the same bag and achieve our goals. I think that's where we're going. I think the concept is really important, to walk before we run. And sometimes we also realize why there was a very strong pushback from certain actors. Of course, we want to accelerate the agenda. It's important for all of us. It's important to get funding for it as well. But the issue is that there are several technologies being developed. We don't know what the right path is. For example, electricals and hybrids with ethanol. in Brazil. We are going towards this herd effect and over uh, diff- jumping over certain stations and alienating people who want to participate, that are not people who don't are not getting an A, are not getting straight A's right away, but they might get there one day. I think our mission is to help them advance as quickly as possible, but in a smart way. Sometimes these herd effects don't bring the best solutions, because sometimes these solutions are not a one size fits all, because maybe a hybrid with ethanol or second generation ethanol, if it's the case, might be even more environment friendly than an electric car. For example, yesterday we were talking about deep sea mining, which is what's happening, and it's funny because deep sea mining wants to get the minerals to make the batteries that ESG is destroying. So there's a huge risk for the oceans. We need to be very careful with our decisions that might lead to consequences. So we need to have this dialogue, this conversation, and tailor the solutions for the specific situations of the country. A last question for all of you. I think we've gone over, but very quickly. No questions, just your last thoughts. What is your last message? I'm going to try to be very concise and objective. I think it's the role of taxonomy and all that. It's very hard, and Rebecca mentioned this earlier. It's very hard to compare different realities around the world from the same perspective, when on the same level, so that they can be comparable. It's a huge, huge challenge. But taxonomy is here to translate exactly that. But it's also important to have a more specific lens to really understand local, regional, and sectorial realities. Climate Bonds has been doing this very well. And I think this is something I've discussed with Leonardo before. The role of transition in taxonomies to bring these different shades of green, that it's not either A nor B, and reach the next step very quickly, but really evolving in time and comparing this not only regionally, but looking at this very condition to the previous period and what it's going to be like in the following period. So how can we reflect these shades of green that we want to bring to the food systems? Well, three things that are essential to get more scale with impact. First, to celebrate what's already been done and done well. I think I was in Belém yesterday, and there's a fundamental role in the region, 50,000 assets, and we see a very relevant environment and social impact. So when we have good examples, we also need to be able to use that and scale it and reproduce and celebrate. One thing I agree 100% is the rules of the games, taxonomy, for all of the banks, in our case as a bank, to be able to apply the same rules and not have a mismatch between banks and investors that maybe value things differently. And it's important to have Brazil sitting at the table to define and to decide on these rules, because you can't play, we can't decide on rules for other countries. And another important point, unfortunately we don't have a lot of time to go over this, but it's the incentive, the financial incentives. And when we see this a certified Brazil nut, it's amazing. So how can we provide this to the producers, to the farmers, like you mentioned, to divide and share this additional costs, and the idea that the end customer, the end buyer, to realize the added value is still a challenge for all of us. All right, trying to be brief. It's very important to be able to value. And I think this marketing, in a way, is really interesting, and it's going to be very important for us. But the most important point that we need to follow, I think we heard this a lot during the day, is the clarity so everybody knows where to go. It's amazing talking to some companies and investors here saying, oh, okay, I will invest if there is no deforestation as of 2018. Or somebody says, okay, deforestation is 2025, and you look at the Brazilian code. So you need to understand, okay, so where do I go? This is a very simple example, but a grain negotiation is something very simple, and clarity is something, one of the things that is really relevant. Something that we discuss here that it'll be very important to work on. Great. Now we close our panel, and let's now thank you for your presence. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's always a pleasure to work with CBI. I think this made a huge difference in Brazil, and now we see the results. Congratulations.